David stood outside the small office building, holding a crumpled piece of paper in his shaking hands. Another rejection letter. The 23rd one in 8 months. His fingers traced the official stamp at the bottom. The same cold, formal rejection he had memorized by now. The autumn wind cut through his jacket as he walked slowly toward his old pickup truck. At 31 years old, David felt like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The long scar that ran from his left ear down to his collar had healed years ago, but the stares it attracted never seemed to fade. 3 years had passed since the accident that changed everything. David had been a firefighter back then, proud of his uniform and the respect it brought him in their small town. He loved helping people, running into burning buildings when everyone else ran out. That was until the warehouse fire on Miller Street went wrong. The roof collapsed, trapping him under burning beams. His partner Jake pulled him out, but not before the flames left their mark. The doctors did their best. 15 surgeries over 2 years. They saved his life, but they couldn't save his face from the twisted scars that now covered the left side. When David looked in the mirror each morning, he saw a stranger looking back. Someone broken. Someone different. Coming home was supposed to be the beginning of his recovery. His family tried to act normal around him, but he could see the pain in their eyes every time they looked at him. His mom would quickly look away when she thought he wasn't watching. His dad would clear his throat awkwardly and change the subject whenever David mentioned going back to work. His younger brother, Tommy, was the only one who didn't treat him differently, but even that felt strange. Tommy would joke around like nothing had happened, but David could tell it was forced. The easy friendship they once shared now felt like walking on thin ice. The worst part wasn't the stares from strangers on the street. It wasn't even the rejection. Letters piling up on his kitchen table. The worst part was how he felt inside, like he was disappearing a little more each day. The man who used to run toward danger to help others now couldn't even bring himself to go to the grocery store without feeling like everyone was staring at him. David drove through downtown, past the fire station where he used to work. Through the big glass doors, he could see his old crew cleaning the truck. For a moment, he thought about stopping in to say hello, but then he remembered the last time he visited. The uncomfortable silence that fell over the room. The way everyone tried. Too hard to act normal. The relief on their faces when he finally left. He kept driving until he reached the edge of town, where old Mrs. Johnson lived alone in a house that was falling apart. Her grandson had asked David to check on her since she'd been having trouble, with kids throwing rocks at her windows. David knocked on the door, and when she opened it, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Johnson smiled. Not the fake, forced smile he was used to getting. A real smile. She invited him in for coffee and didn't stare at his scars once during their 2-hour conversation. She talked to him like he was still the same David who used to help her carry groceries, because to her he was. "You know, David," she said as he prepared to leave, "I've been living in this town for 73 years. I've seen a lot of young men come back from hard times looking different than when they left. The ones who make it are the ones who remember that they're still the same person inside." On his drive home, David thought about her words. Maybe she was right. Maybe he was still the same person who wanted to help people. Maybe the scars didn't change that part of him. He pulled over at the community center and saw a small sign posted on the bulletin board outside. Volunteers needed. Youth mentorship program. Help guide local teenagers who are struggling with life challenges. No experience necessary. Just a willingness to listen and care. David stared at the sign for a long time. These would be kids who probably knew what it felt like to be different, to be judged, to feel like the world had given up on them. Kids who might need someone who understood what it was like to feel broken. He took a picture of the sign with his phone. For the first time in months, he felt something stirring inside him that he had almost forgotten. Hope. Maybe his scars weren't the end of his story. Maybe they were just the beginning of a different chapter. That night, David sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open, typing an email to the program coordinator. He wrote about his background as a firefighter, his experience helping people in crisis, and his desire to make a difference in young people's lives. He almost deleted the part about his accident and scars 3 times before finally hitting send. 2 days later, his phone rang. The voice on the other end was warm and encouraging. They wanted to meet with him. They were excited about his application. For the first time in 3 years, someone was saying yes instead of no. As David hung up the phone, he walked to the bathroom mirror and looked at his reflection. The scars were still there, still visible, still a permanent reminder of the worst day of his life. But maybe Mrs. Johnson was right. Maybe he was still the same person inside, someone who wanted to help, someone who cared, someone who could make a difference. The meeting was set for next Tuesday. David had 6 days to prepare, 6 days to find the courage he used to have, 6 days to remember who he really was underneath the scars. For the first time since the accident, David went to bed that night feeling like tomorrow might actually be better than today. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything would start to change. This was the moment a broken firefighter would begin his journey to become something he never expected. A hero to kids who needed someone to show them that being different didn't mean being less than anyone else. David's hands were sweating as he pushed open the heavy doors of the community center. The meeting with the program coordinator had gone well 3 days ago, but now came the real test, facing a room full of teenagers who had their own reasons for being here. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the small meeting room. 12 folding chairs formed a circle, and 11 of them were already occupied. The kids ranged from about 14 to 17, and David could tell immediately that none of them wanted to be there. Arms crossed, eyes rolling, slouched in. Chairs. The universal language of teenage attitude was on full display. "Everyone, this is David," said Lisa, the program coordinator. "He's going to be working with you all as your new mentor." She gave David an encouraging smile before quietly slipping out of the room, leaving him alone with 12 pairs of eyes that were sizing him up. David took a deep breath and sat down in the empty chair. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Finally, a tall boy with bleached hair and multiple piercings spoke up. "What happened to your face, man?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Before David could answer, a girl with bright purple streaks in her hair snorted. "Looks like someone went through a blender." A few kids snickered. Another boy, this one wearing a torn band t-shirt, leaned forward with a smirk. "So they send us the damaged guy to fix us? That's rich." David felt the familiar burn of shame creeping up his neck. This was exactly what he had feared would happen. The same reactions he got everywhere else. The stares, the comments, the assumption that someone who looked different couldn't possibly have anything valuable to offer. For a moment, he considered making an excuse and leaving. It would be so easy to tell Lisa that this wasn't working out, that maybe they needed someone more suitable for the job, someone who wouldn't be a distraction, someone normal. But then he remembered Mrs. Johnson's words about being the same person, inside. He thought about all the rejection letters on his kitchen table and how tired he was of running away from uncomfortable situations. Most importantly, he looked around the room and recognized something in these kids' eyes that he knew all too well, the defensive anger that comes from feeling like the world has already decided you're not worth much. Instead of getting up and leaving, David did something unexpected. He pulled his chair directly in front of the boy who had made the blender comment, a skinny kid with angry eyes who was clearly the group's unofficial leader. "What's your name?" David asked quietly. The boy looked surprised by the direct approach. "Why do you care?" "Because I'm going to be spending time with you, and I'd rather not call you, 'Hey you,' for the next few months." "It's Alex," the boy muttered, suddenly not looking so confident. David nodded. "Nice to meet you, Alex. You're right about my face. I know I look different, and I know it makes people uncomfortable. These scars are ugly, and they're permanent, and every single day someone stares at me or makes a comment about them, HFY. Room had gone completely silent now. Even the kids who had been whispering in the back were listening. But do you know what I learned? David continued, his voice steady and calm. I learned that the people who judge you based on how you look usually don't know anything about who you really are. And their opinions don't get to decide what you're worth. A girl with short black hair who had been silent until now suddenly spoke up. Easy to say when you're the adult getting paid to be here. David turned to her. You think I'm getting paid for this? The girl shrugged. Aren't you? Nope. I'm a volunteer. I work construction during the day to pay my bills, and I come here at night because I want to be here. Why? This came from a different boy, one who had been drawing in a notebook and hadn't looked up once since David arrived. Because 3 years ago, I was a firefighter. I loved my job, I was good at it, and I thought I had my whole life figured out. Then there was an accident and everything changed. Not just how I looked, but how people treated me, how I saw myself, how I moved through the world. David paused, looking around the circle at faces that were no longer showing mockery but genuine curiosity. I spent 2 years feeling sorry for myself. 2 years thinking that because I looked different, I was somehow less than everyone else. 2 years letting other people's reactions define who I was. And you know what I realized? I was giving them way too much power over my life. The purple-haired girl leaned forward slightly. So what changed? I got tired of feeling worthless. I got tired of hiding. And I realized that maybe the things that make us different, the things that other people judge us for, maybe those things can actually be our greatest strengths. Alex, who had been quiet since his initial challenge, finally spoke up. How is being scarred up a strength? Because now I can spot someone who's hurting from a mile away. Because I know what it feels like to be judged before people even know your name. Because I understand that sometimes the people who look the roughest on the outside are fighting the hardest battles on the inside. The room was completely quiet now, but it was a different kind of quiet than when David had first walked in. This wasn't uncomfortable silence. This was the sound of young people actually listening, maybe for the first time in a long while. A small girl who looked younger than the others raised her hand tentatively. Were you scared? When you came in here tonight? David smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in weeks. Terrified, I almost turned around and went home twice on the way here, but I'm glad I didn't. Why? Several voices asked at once. Because I think we might actually understand each other. And maybe if we give this a chance, we can figure out some things together that none of us could figure out alone. For the first time since the accident, David felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. 6 months had passed since that first awkward meeting at the community center, and David had learned something important. Earning trust takes time, but it's worth every difficult moment along the way. The group still met every Tuesday night, but the atmosphere had completely changed. Instead of 12 angry teenagers slumped in their chairs, David now saw young people who actually looked forward to these sessions. They would text him during the week, share their problems, and ask for advice on everything from school troubles to family drama. Alex, the boy who had first challenged David about his scars, had become one of his most dedicated participants. The anger was still there, but now it was directed at real problems instead of just lashing out at anyone nearby. The purple-haired girl, who went by Luna, had started bringing her artwork to share with the group. The quiet boy, who used to just draw in his notebook, turned out to be incredibly wise when he finally started talking. But it was on a rainy Thursday evening in March that everything truly changed. David had planned to discuss goal setting that night. But as soon as everyone settled into their circle, he could tell something was different. The energy in the room felt heavy, like a storm was building. Several of the kids looked like they hadn't slept well, and Luna kept wiping her eyes when she thought no one was looking. "All right," David said, setting aside his prepared notes. Forget what we were supposed to talk about tonight. What's really going on? The silence stretched on for several minutes. These kids had learned to trust David, but opening up about their deepest fears was still terrifying. Finally, Tyler, a 16-year-old who had been in the program for 4 months, took a shaky breath. "Can we talk about being afraid?" he asked quietly. David nodded. "Of course. What kind of afraid?" "All kinds, I guess. But mostly afraid. That no matter what we do, people will always see us as the screwed-up kids who needed help." This opened the floodgates. One by one, the teenagers began sharing fears they had never spoken out loud before. Kayla was afraid she would never be smart enough for college because she had missed so much school due to family problems. Jordan was terrified that his anger issues would hurt someone he cared about, just like his father had hurt their family. But it was Alex who said the words that hit David like a punch to the stomach. "My biggest fear," Alex said, staring at his hands, "is that I'm going to turn out exactly like my dad. He was always angry, always yelling, always making everyone around him miserable. And sometimes I feel that same anger building up inside me, and I think maybe I'm just broken the same way he was." Alex looked up, and for the first time since David had known him, there were tears in his eyes. "But I'm also scared that even if I change, even if I become a better person, people will always remember me as the kid who got kicked out of school for fighting. Like that's all I'll ever be." The room was completely silent. David felt his heart pounding because Alex had just put into words the exact same fear that had haunted David for 3 years. The fear that one bad moment, one terrible event, could define you forever in other people's minds. "Alex," David said softly, "can I tell you about the worst day of my life?" Over the next hour, David shared his story in more detail than he ever had before. He talked about the warehouse fire, about watching his partner Jake risk his own life to pull him out of the flames. He described the months in the hospital, the painful surgeries, the moment he first saw his reflection and didn't recognize himself. But more importantly, he talked about the shame, the way he avoided mirrors for months afterward, how he stopped going places where he might run into people he knew, the job interviews where he could see the interviewer's expression change the moment they saw his face. "I was so convinced that these scars defined me," David said. "I thought they were proof that I was damaged, that I was less than everyone else, that I would never be the person I used to be." Luna spoke up. "But you are, though. You're still that same person who ran into burning buildings to help people." David smiled. "It took me a long time to see that, and you know what finally made me realize it? Sitting in this room with all of you." "What do you mean?" Tyler asked. "Because every single one of you has shown me that we're not defined by our worst moments or our biggest struggles. Kayla, you missed a lot of school, but you're one of the smartest people I know. Jordan, yes, you get angry sometimes, but you also have more compassion than most adults I've met. And Alex, you might have your dad's temper, but you also have his strength, and you get to choose how to use it." David looked around the circle at these young people who had become so important to him. "The truth is, we all have scars. Some of mine just happen to be visible, but yours are just as real, just as painful, and just as much a part of your story." "So what do we do with them?" Kayla asked. "We decide what they mean. We get to choose whether our scars are proof that we're broken or proof that we survived something that could have destroyed us. We get to decide whether our struggles make us weak or whether they make us strong enough to help other people who are going through the same things." Alex wiped his eyes and looked directly at David. "You really think we can change how people see us?" "I think," David said, "that when you change how you see yourself, it changes everything else too. People can only define you if you let them." That night, as the teenagers filed out of the community center, each of them stopped to thank David before leaving. But it wasn't gratitude for his words of wisdom or his guidance. They were thanking him for something much simpler and much more powerful: for seeing them as more than their mistakes, more than their problems, more than the labels other people had put on them. For the first time since the accident, David felt like his scars had served a purpose. They had become a bridge to these young people's pain, and somehow in helping them heal, he had found his own healing too. David never expected the phone call that came on a quiet Sunday morning in October. It was Mrs. Patterson from the school board, and her voice carried a tone he hadn't heard in years, genuine excitement about something he had done. "David, we need to talk," she said. "The changes we're seeing in these kids, it's remarkable. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" Over the past year, word about David's group had started spreading through their small town, but not always in ways he appreciated. At first, some parents complained about having a disfigured man working with their children. There were heated discussions at PTA meetings about whether someone with David's condition was appropriate for youth mentorship. But something interesting was happening that even the critics couldn't ignore. The 12 teenagers in David's program were changing in ways that surprised everyone, including their own families. Alex, who used to get suspended from school at least once a month for fighting, hadn't been in trouble for over 8 months. His grades had improved from failing to mostly B's, and his teachers reported that he was actually helping other students with their problems instead of creating them. Luna had channeled her artistic talents into creating a mural at the community center that depicted the journey from darkness to hope. Local businesses started asking if she would paint murals for them too. She went from being known as that weird girl with purple hair to being recognized as a talented young artist. Tyler had started a peer counseling program at the high school, helping other students who were struggling with anxiety and depression. The guidance counselor told David that Tyler had a natural gift for making people feel heard and understood. But the real proof of the program's impact came when these teenagers started organizing their own community service projects. Without being asked or required, they began cleaning up the local park every Saturday morning. They volunteered at the nursing home, reading to elderly residents and helping with activities. They tutored younger kids at the library after school. The same young people who had once been written off as troublemakers were now becoming positive forces in their community. And people were starting to notice. David's phone started ringing, with requests he never saw coming. The county's Veteran Services Office wanted him to speak at their monthly meeting about innovative approaches to helping veterans readjust to civilian life. A non-profit organization 3 towns over asked if he could help them start a similar program. "We've heard amazing things about your work," the non-profit director told him. "These kids aren't just staying out of trouble. They're becoming leaders. How are you doing it?" David found himself struggling to answer that question. He hadn't used any special techniques or revolutionary methods. He had simply shown up consistently, listened without judgment, and shared his own struggles honestly. Somehow, that had been enough. The most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Chief Rodriguez, David's former boss at the fire department, stopped by the community center one Tuesday evening, just as the group was ending. "David, can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked. David's stomach dropped. He hadn't spoken to Chief Rodriguez since the awkward visit to the firehouse 2 years ago. He assumed this was going to be another uncomfortable conversation about how things had changed. Instead, Chief Rodriguez surprised him completely. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "When you got hurt, I didn't know how to handle it. I was so focused on what you couldn't do anymore that I completely missed what you could do. What you're doing here with these kids. This is exactly the kind of thing that makes someone a real firefighter." David felt tears burning behind his eyes. "Chief, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do. Running into burning buildings is just part of the job. But what you're doing here, saving kids who are drowning in their own lives, this is the real deal, David. You're still saving lives, just in a different way." As Chief Rodriguez left, Alex appeared beside David. "Was that your old boss?" "Yeah. David said, still processing the conversation. He seemed pretty impressed with you. David smiled. I think he was more impressed with you guys. You're the ones doing all the hard work of changing. Maybe, Alex said thoughtfully. But you showed us it was possible. Before I met you, I thought people like us were just stuck being the way we are. You proved that wasn't true. That weekend, David received a letter that changed everything. It was from the state's Department of Youth Services, offering him a position to develop and oversee similar mentorship programs across the entire state. The salary was more than he had ever made as a firefighter, and the opportunity to help hundreds of at-risk young people was exactly the kind of purpose he had been searching for. But as exciting as the offer was, David found himself thinking about something else entirely. Earlier that week, a new kid had joined their group, a 15-year-old named Blake who reminded David so much of himself at that age. Angry, hurt, convinced that the world was against him, and desperately needing someone to show him a different way forward. David looked at the job offer again, then picked up his phone and called the state office. I'm honored by your offer, he told them, but I think I need to stay right here for now. These kids still need me, and honestly, I still need them too. The truth was, David had finally found where he belonged, not in some prestigious state position, but in a small community center room, sitting in a circle with young people who understood what it meant to be judged, to be written off, to be told you're not good enough. He had spent so many years trying to get back to who he used to be. Now he realized he had become someone even better, someone whose scars had taught him how to help others heal their own wounds. The warrior wasn't just rising from the ashes, he was teaching others that they could rise too. 3 years after that first terrifying Tuesday night at the community center, David found himself standing in front of the state capitol building, adjusting his tie and trying to calm his nerves. Today, he would address the state legislature about funding for veteran-led youth mentorship programs. But the journey to this moment still felt surreal. The program that had started with 12 angry teenagers in a small-town community center had grown beyond anything David could have imagined. Word had spread to neighboring counties, and now there were similar groups running in 8 different towns across the state. Each one was led by a veteran who understood what it meant to feel broken and forgotten by society. David's phone buzzed, with a text from Alex, who was now 20 years old and working as a youth counselor himself. Saw you on the news this morning. Still can't believe my old mentor is about to talk to the governor. Don't forget us little people when you're famous. The message made David smile, but it also reminded him of something important. This wasn't about him becoming famous or important. This was about proving that everyone deserves a second chance, and that sometimes the people society considers damaged are exactly the ones who can create the most healing. Inside the Capitol building, David was introduced to reporters, state officials, and advocates who wanted to hear about his revolutionary approach to youth mentorship. But David kept thinking about how simple it really was. Show up consistently. Listen without judgment. Share your own struggles honestly. Believe in people when they can't believe in themselves. Mr. David, one reporter asked, what do you think makes your program so successful compared to traditional approaches? David thought for a moment. I think it's because we don't try to hide our own problems. These kids have been lied to their whole lives by adults who pretend to have everything figured out. When they meet someone who admits they're still figuring it out too, it creates real connection. The reporter nodded, but David could tell she was looking for something more dramatic, more newsworthy. The truth was, there was no magic formula. Just wounded people helping other wounded people heal. When David finally entered the legislative chamber, he was surprised to see familiar faces in the gallery. His brother Tommy had driven down from their hometown, along with Mrs. Johnson, who was now 85 and had insisted on making the 4-hour trip to see David speak. Even Chief Rodriguez was there, wearing his dress uniform and giving David a thumbs up. But the faces that meant the most to him were clustered together in the front row of the public seating area. Alex and Luna had taken time off work to be there. Tyler had driven down from the college where he was studying social work. Kayla, now a freshman at the state university, sat next to Blake, who had graduated from the program 6 months ago and was planning to join the military. As David approached the podium, he caught sight of his reflection in the chamber's tall windows. The scars were still there, as visible as ever. But the man looking back at him was completely different from the broken, ashamed person who had sat in his pickup truck 3 years ago, holding rejection letter after rejection letter. "Members of the legislature," David began, his voice steady and clear. "3 years ago, I was a man who had given up on himself. I thought my scars made me unemployable, unmarriageable, and essentially useless to society. I was wrong about all of those things, but I was especially wrong about being useless." David went on to share statistics about the program's success rate. 87% of participants had avoided any further legal trouble. 93% had either graduated high school or earned their equivalency certificates. But, more importantly, he shared stories of transformation that couldn't be captured in numbers. He talked about Alex, who had gone from being expelled from school to becoming a youth counselor himself. He described Luna's artwork, which now decorated public buildings throughout their region and carried messages of hope for other struggling young people. He mentioned Tyler's peer counseling program, which had expanded to 3 high schools and was credited with preventing several serious situations. "These young people didn't need someone to fix them," David explained. "They needed someone to see them as whole human beings who happened to be going through difficult times. They needed someone who understood that making mistakes doesn't make you a mistake." When David finished his presentation, the chamber erupted in applause. But as he looked out at the faces of the legislators, David realized something had shifted. They weren't applauding him as an inspiring individual who had overcome personal tragedy. They were applauding a proven solution to a problem that had seemed unsolvable. After the session, David was surrounded by people wanting to know how they could bring similar programs to their own communities. State funding was approved unanimously. National organizations expressed interest in replicating the model. A publisher approached him about writing a book, but the moment that mattered most came when Blake approached him outside the Capitol building. Blake was the angry 15-year-old who had joined the group 2 years earlier, convinced that the world was against him and that he was destined to repeat his father's mistakes. "David," Blake said, "I need to tell you something. When I first met you, I thought you were just another adult who was going to give up on me as soon as things got difficult. But you never did. Even when I was at my worst, you kept showing up. You kept believing I could be better." Blake paused, his voice getting emotional. "I'm leaving for basic training next month. I'm going to serve my country, and then I want to come back and do what you do. I want to help kids like I used to be. And none of that would have happened if you hadn't shown me that my past doesn't have to define my future." As David drove home that evening, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. The warehouse fire that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something much more important than his old life as a firefighter. Those scars that had made him feel like a monster had become the very thing that allowed him to connect with young people who felt monstrous themselves. His phone rang as he pulled into his driveway. It was Tommy, his younger brother. "David, I have to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. When you got hurt, I was so scared that I was going to lose my big brother, and for a while, it felt like I had. But watching you today, seeing what you've become, you're not the same person you used to be. You're someone even better." That night, David stood in his bathroom, looking at himself in the mirror just like he had 3 years ago. The scars were still there, still visible, still a permanent reminder of the worst day of his life. But they no longer looked like symbols of defeat. They looked like proof that you can survive anything. They looked like evidence that sometimes being broken is just the first step toward becoming something stronger. They looked like the foundation of a legend that was still being written. David had learned that legends aren't born from perfection. They're born from the courage to transform your greatest struggles into your most powerful gifts. The human warrior had indeed walked into legend, not by hiding his scars, but by teaching the world that sometimes our deepest wounds can become our greatest sources of strength.